A dying rancher held his final dose of heart medicine, the only thing standing between him and the grave. But when he found a wounded girl from a rival tribe collapsing on his porch, he made a choice that would seal his fate. Ignoring his own survival, he gave her the last drop, accepting that he would not live to see another sunset. Yet, as dawn broke, he didn't wake to silence. He woke to the thunderous sound of 300 war horses encircling his cabin.
Medicine, urgently!
The most feared warriors in the territory had tracked him down, and as the dust settled, the tribal chief stepped forward, ready to deliver a judgment that would change everything. The Arizona sun beat down on the scorched earth of the Broken Wheel Ranch like a blacksmith's hammer, turning the air into a shimmering curtain of heat. It was 1887, a time when the frontier had no mercy for the weak, and Silas Thorne knew his time was running out. At 58, Silas looked 20 years older, his skin weathered like old leather and his frame gaunt from the sickness that had been eating away at his chest for months. He sat on the edge of his dusty porch, his trembling fingers clutching a small amber vial. Inside that glass container swirled the last dose of the heart tonic he had ordered from back east, the only thing that stopped the crushing pressure in his chest from turning into a fatal grip. It was enough to buy him another week, maybe two, of watching the sun set over the Red Rock Ridge. But as he uncorked the bottle, ready to drink the bitter salvation, a sound from the edge of the yard froze him. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't a coyote. It was the heavy, dragging sound of a body hitting the dirt. Silas lowered the vial and squinted into the blinding glare. There, collapsing near his water trough, was a figure. He forced his aching legs to move, stumbling off the porch toward the intruder. It wasn't a bandit or a drifter. It was a girl, no older than 19, with long dark braids matted with dust and blood. She was Apache. Her buckskin dress was torn, and a deep gash on her side was bleeding sluggishly, draining the life out of her with every shallow breath. Silas knew the tension in the territory. The Apache were fighting for their land, and ranchers were fighting for their lives. By all logic, she was the enemy, but looking down at her, Silas didn't see a warrior. He saw a child in pain. Her lips were cracked and blue, her eyes rolling back in her head as her heart fluttered like a trapped bird. She was going into shock. Silas looked at the girl, then at the amber vial in his hand. He knew the medicine was a potent stimulant, capable of jump-starting a failing heart or giving a dying man a few more days. It could save her, but the bottle was empty after one dose. If he gave it to her, he would be dead within 24 hours. The silence of the desert stretched out heavy and judging. Silas looked at the jagged horizon, then back at the girl's terrified, glazing eyes. He let out a long, ragged sigh, the sound of a man accepting his fate. With a steady hand, he knelt, lifted her head, and poured the precious liquid between her parched lips. He watched as she swallowed, the medicine working its way into her system. He had just signed his own death warrant to save a stranger who might not even thank him. If this act of ultimate sacrifice grabbed your attention, hit the like button right now. Silas didn't have the strength to move her inside, so he dragged a buffalo robe from the porch and covered her where she lay in the shade of the overhang. He collapsed into his rocking chair, the wood groaning under his weight, and waited. As the afternoon wore on, the girl's breathing deepened and steadied. The color returned to her cheeks. The medicine had done its work. But for Silas, the clock was ticking faster. The familiar tightening in his chest returned, sharper this time, a cold iron band constricting his lungs. He watched the sun dip below the Red Rock Ridge, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and orange, wondering if it was the last sunset he would ever see. He didn't regret it. He had lived a long, hard life, full of mistakes and solitude. Saving the girl felt like the first clean thing he had done in years. Night fell over the Arizona territory, bringing a chill that seeped into Silas' bones. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his dreams feverish and disjointed. He dreamed of his wife, long buried, and of the children they never had. He woke periodically to check on the girl. She was sleeping soundly now, her survival all but assured. He, however, could feel the end approaching. His breath came in shallow rasps, and his left arm felt numb. He sat in the darkness, weaponless and weak, simply waiting for the inevitable. He hoped death would be kind, a gentle fading rather than a violent seizure. But the dawn brought something far more terrifying than death. As the first grey light of morning touched the dust bowl surrounding his cabin, the ground began to tremble. At first, Silas thought it was his own failing heart pounding in his ears, but the vibration grew stronger, rattling the tin cups on the porch railing. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a rhythm, a thunderous, coordinated pounding of hooves. Silas forced his eyes open and gripped the armrests of his chair. Through the morning mist, they appeared like ghosts manifesting from the earth. Riders, hundreds of them. They crested the ridge and poured into the valley, a river of muscle and painted skin. 300 Apache warriors, mounted on war horses, their faces marked with the colors of battle. They didn't yell, they didn't shoot. They rode with a terrifying, disciplined silence that was louder than any war cry. They encircled the cabin, forming a suffocating ring of steel and flesh. The dust kicked up by their horses choked the air, turning the sunrise into a hazy, blood-red backdrop. Silas realized with a jolt that went straight to his failing heart that he hadn't just saved a random girl. The markings on her dress, which he had ignored in his haste, matched the patterns on the shields of the riders. He had intercepted the daughter of the most feared tribe in the territory. The circle tightened, spears glinted in the morning sun, rifles rested easily across the laps of men who knew how to use them. Silas sat frozen. He had no gun within reach, and even if he did, he couldn't lift it. He was a dead man sitting in a rocking chair, staring down the entire might of the Apache nation. The girl, Kaya, stirred on the floorboards, the noise finally rousing her from her medicated sleep. She sat up groggy, her eyes widening as she saw the wall of warriors surrounding them. From the ranks of the riders, one man guided his horse forward. He was immense, his chest broad and scarred, his face a mask of stoic authority, painted in black and white. It was Chief Talon. Even the white settlers who hated the tribes spoke his name with a tremble in their voice. He was known for his ruthlessness in battle and his unyielding code of honor. He stared at Silas with eyes like dark flint. Silas looked back, unable to stand, unable to speak. He wondered if they thought he had kidnapped her, if they thought he had hurt her. In the Wild West, misunderstandings were solved with bullets and blades, not conversation. The chief's gaze shifted to Kaya, then back to the dying rancher. The air was so thick with tension it felt like a match strike would ignite the entire valley. Would you have risked it all for a stranger? Tell us what you would do in the comments below. Chief Talon dismounted. His boots hit the dust with a heavy thud that echoed in the silence. He handed his reins to a nearby warrior and began to walk toward the porch. Every step was deliberate. Silas closed his eyes for a moment, making peace with God. He expected the cold bite of a knife or the sudden burn of a bullet. He had nothing left to give, no fight left in his broken body. He had traded his life for the girls, and it seemed the trade was about to be collected in full. Kaya tried to stand, to speak, but her voice was a raspy whisper. She reached out a hand toward her father, but Talon didn't stop. He walked up the wooden steps, the boards creaking under his imposing weight until he towered over the frail rancher in the rocking chair. The chief reached for the knife at his belt. The sunlight caught the blade as he drew it from its sheath. Silas didn't flinch. He was too tired to be afraid anymore. He simply looked up at the warrior, his breathing ragged, his heart stuttering its final rhythms. Talon raised the weapon. The warriors watched, unmoving statues of judgment. Before we reveal the chief's shocking decision, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more legendary tales of the Wild West. The blow never came. With a fluid motion, Chief Talon flipped the knife and drove it into the porch railing, leaving it quivering in the wood. It wasn't a threat, it was a sign that weapons were put aside. He placed a heavy, calloused hand on Silas' shoulder, not with aggression, but with a grip that steadied the dying man. "You gave her the water of life," Talon said, his voice deep and resonating like distant thunder. His English was broken but clear. "You gave her your tomorrow so she could have today." Silas blinked, confused, his vision blurring. She was just a child," he wheezed. Talon nodded slowly. He turned and signaled to the warriors. The ranks parted, and an old woman stepped forward. It was Elu, the tribe's shaman, hunched over and adorned with bone necklaces and eagle feathers. She didn't carry a weapon. She carried a leather satchel worn smooth by years of use. She moved up the stairs with surprising speed for her age, her sharp eyes assessing Silas' grey skin and blue lips instantly. She knelt beside him, opening the pouch to reveal a collection of roots, dried leaves, and a paste that smelled of earth and pine. "White man medicine is weak," Talon stated, watching Elu work. "The earth is strong." Elu mixed a dark, pungent paste and pressed it to Silas' chest, right over his heart. The sensation was immediate, a burning heat that seemed to seep through his skin and wrap around his struggling organ. Then she took a small skin of water, mixed in a powder that sparkled like gold dust, and held it to his lips. Silas drank. It tasted like fire and copper, but as it hit his stomach, the constriction in his chest began to loosen. The iron band snapped. A rush of warmth flooded his cold limbs. The warriors didn't raise their tomahawks to strike. As one, 300 men raised their hands in a salute of profound respect. The thunder of hooves returned, but this time it wasn't an approach. It was a celebration. By saving the girl, the dying rancher hadn't sealed his doom. He had just been adopted into the most powerful family on the frontier. Chief Talon looked at Silas, a rare smile cracking his war paint. "You do not die today, Silas Thorne. Today you are reborn as brother to the Apache." The rancher, who expected to die alone, was now surrounded by a new army of protectors, granting him a life he never expected. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more incredible stories. The morning sun, which Silas had expected to be his last, now felt like a baptism of fire upon his skin. The miraculous heat from the paste Elu had applied did not fade. Instead, it settled deep within his chest, a steady, rhythmic thrumming that replaced the erratic fluttering of his failing heart. For the first time in months, he took a breath that filled his lungs completely, the air tasting of sagebrush and the metallic tang of the adrenaline that still coursed through his veins. He stood on the porch of the Broken Wheel Ranch, no longer a man waiting for the reaper, but a man witnessing the impossible. The Dust Bowl, usually a barren expanse of loneliness, was alive with the vibrant, terrifying energy of the Apache. 300 warriors had not just surrounded his home, they had fortified
I
it.
need medicine.
Talon
urgently.
remained on the porch, his presence as solid and unyielding as the Red Rock Ridge in the distance. The chief did not speak immediately, his dark eyes scanning the horizon, reading the wind and the shifting shadows of the clouds. Silas looked at the knife still quivering in the wood of the railing, a reminder of how close death had come and how swiftly it had been transformed into an alliance. He shifted his gaze to Kaya. The girl was no longer the helpless, bleeding creature he had found. Though pale, she sat upright on a blanket near the steps, her strength returning with the resilience of youth. She caught Silas staring and offered a nod, a small, silent gesture that carried the weight of a blood debt. There were no words for what had passed between them, only the shared understanding of survival against the odds. However, peace was a fleeting illusion in the Arizona territory. The silence of the morning was broken not by the cry of a hawk, but by the sharp, rhythmic signal of a scout positioned on the high ground. Talon stiffened, his head snapping toward the east. The warriors in the yard, who had been resting or tending to their horses, moved with a sudden fluid synchronization. Rifles were checked, bows were strung, and the relaxed atmosphere evaporated instantly, replaced by the cold, hard tension of impending violence. Silas felt the change in the air, a static charge that raised the hair on his arms. He stepped closer to the railing, squinting against the glare. Far in the distance, a cloud of dust was rising, churning against the blue sky. It was too organized to be a dust devil, too fast to be a herd of cattle. Riders, a lot of them. Silas felt a knot form in his stomach, not from his illness, but from a new sinking dread. He knew who rode from the east. It wasn't more Apache. It was the world he belonged to, the world that had forgotten him until now. Talon stepped down from the porch, barking a command in his native tongue. The warriors scattered, melting into the shadows of the barn, behind the water trough, and into the tall brush surrounding the cabin. Within seconds, the yard looked abandoned, save for the few horses tethered loosely to bait the trap. The chief turned back to Silas, his expression grim. He pointed a finger at the dust cloud and then at the cabin door. The message was clear: hide. But Silas shook his head. If he hid, the approaching riders would walk into a massacre. If he hid, the ranch would become a graveyard for men who, despite their flaws, were likely coming because they thought he was in trouble. Or so he hoped. Silas gripped the railing, his knuckles white. He turned to Elu, who was packing her herbs away with unhurried calm. She looked at him, her ancient eyes knowing. She didn't tell him to hide. She simply watched, waiting to see what the man with the new heart would do. Silas looked back at Talon. The chief was waiting for a decision. This was the true test of the brotherhood Talon had proclaimed. Silas was not just a survivor now. He was a bridge between two warring storms. The rumble of hooves grew louder, a chaotic thunder distinct from the disciplined gallop of the Apache. Through the haze, Silas made out the shapes of hats and the glint of sheriff badges. It was a posse, likely gathered from the nearest town, heavily armed and riding hard. Leading them was not the sheriff, but a man Silas recognized with a bitter taste in his mouth, Judson, a land speculator who had been eyeing the ranch for years, waiting for Silas to die so he could snatch the water rights. Judson wasn't here to save a neighbor. He was here to confirm a death and claim a prize. Silas realized with a jolt that the conflict was no longer about his survival, but about the inevitable collision of two worlds that hated each other. If Judson saw the Apache, he would shoot first. If Talon felt threatened, he would wipe the posse off the face of the earth. Silas walked down the steps, his legs steady, moving past the hidden warriors. He could feel their eyes on him, hundreds of them, watching his every step. He walked to the center of the dusty yard and stood alone, an old man in a faded shirt, unarmed, standing between the invisible army of the Apache and the approaching thunder of the white men. The posse slowed as they approached the gate, their horses foaming and skittish. They smelled the Apache ponies, even if the riders didn't see them. Judson pulled his horse up sharply, his hand hovering over the pistol at his hip. He looked at Silas with genuine shock, as if seeing a ghost. He had expected a corpse, or perhaps a cabin burned to the ground. Instead, he found the dying man standing tall, looking healthier than he had in a decade. Judson spat tobacco juice into the dust, his eyes darting around the silent yard. He sensed the trap. He looked back at Silas, his surprise turning to suspicion. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Silas knew that one wrong word, one sudden movement, and the air would be filled with lead and arrows. He had to defuse the situation, but he couldn't reveal his protectors without triggering a slaughter. Judson leaned forward in his saddle, his voice grating like gravel. He asked Silas why he was still breathing and why the air smelled of savage horses. Silas held his ground, his voice steady. He told Judson to turn around. He told him there was nothing here for him, that the land was not for sale, and that death had come and gone without taking a soul. But Judson wasn't listening to the words. He was looking at the ground. He saw the tracks, hundreds of unshod hoof prints. The realization hit Judson at the same moment the wind shifted, blowing the barn door slightly ajar to reveal the painted flank of a war horse. Judson screamed a warning, ripping his pistol from its holster. The time for words shattered. Silas threw up his hands, shouting for them to stop, but the fear was a spark in a room full of powder. Behind Silas, the sound of bowstrings being drawn taut was a collective inhale of death. Talon emerged from the shadows of the porch, not with a weapon raised, but with his arms crossed. A challenge of absolute dominance. The posse panicked. Horses reared, men shouted, and rifles were leveled. Silas stood in the crossfire, the only thing preventing the first shot. He looked at Judson, seeing the greed replaced by terror, and then he looked back at Talon, seeing the calm assurance of a predator who had already won. Silas realized he had to make a choice that would define the rest of his borrowed life. He couldn't just be a bystander. He had to take command of this impossible alliance. Silas took a step toward the posse, placing his body directly in the line of fire of the lead rider. He shouted that anyone who fired a shot would not leave the valley alive. He declared that the warriors were not his captors, but his guests, and that any attack on them was an attack on him. The declaration hung in the air, absurd and treasonous to the ears of the men on horseback. A rancher siding with the Apache was unheard of, a betrayal of blood and race. But as they looked past Silas, seeing the sheer number of warriors materializing from the landscape like ghosts taking form, the reality of the situation sank in. They were vastly outnumbered. Judson's face turned a shade of purple, his finger trembling on the trigger. He accused Silas of madness, of turning against his own kind. But Silas felt a clarity he had never known. His own kind had left him to rot in isolation, waiting for his land to become available. The people behind him, the ones painted for war, had given him life when they owed him nothing. The lines of loyalty had been redrawn in the dust of the Broken Wheel Ranch. The tension reached its breaking point. A young deputy near the back of the posse, terrified and shaking, let his rifle slip. The loud clatter of the weapon hitting the saddle horn sounded like a gunshot. In an instant, 3 arrows thudded into the dirt just inches from the front line of the posse's horses. A warning shot executed with terrifying precision. The horses bolted, creating chaos in the ranks. Silas didn't flinch. He kept his eyes locked on Judson, daring him to make the mistake that would end them all. Talon walked down the steps, stopping beside Silas. The image of the weathered rancher and the imposing chief standing shoulder to shoulder was a sight that defied every law of the frontier. It was a message stronger than any treaty. The conflict had not been resolved. It had merely evolved. Silas had saved a girl, but in doing so he had started a war with the world he used to know. As Judson wheeled his horse around, shouting threats of returning with the army, Silas knew this was only the beginning. The dust settled slowly as the posse retreated, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than before. Silas looked at Talon, and then at the horizon where the riders were disappearing. The real fight for the ranch and for his soul had just begun. The dust from the retreating posse had barely settled back onto the parched earth of the Broken Wheel Ranch when the adrenaline that had been sustaining Silas Thorne finally evaporated. The silence that followed was not the empty, lonely silence he had known for years, but a heavy, expectant stillness filled with the presence of 300 warriors. Silas turned to look at Chief Talon, intending to offer a nod of gratitude, but the movement severed the fragile thread holding his body together. The iron band around his chest, which he had ignored while facing down Judson's gun, suddenly tightened with crushing force. His vision blurred, the vibrant war paint of the riders smearing into streaks of red and ochre against the blue Arizona sky. His knees buckled, hitting the wooden planks of the porch with a hollow thud that echoed louder than a gunshot in the quiet yard. Chief Talon moved, with a speed that belied his size, catching the rancher before he could strike the floor. The great leader's grip was like steel, holding Silas upright even as his own strength failed him completely. Kaya was there in an instant, her voice piercing the haze of Silas' fading consciousness, calling out to him in a language he did not understand but felt in the marrow of his bones. Silas tried to speak, tried to tell them it was all right, that this was the price he had agreed to pay when he poured that amber vial down the girl's throat, but no air would enter his lungs. He was drowning in the dry desert air, his heart fluttering like a trapped bird against his ribs. He looked up at the weathered face of the chief, seeing not a savage, but a man who understood the weight of life and death better than anyone. Silas closed his eyes, accepting that his time had come, content that he was not dying alone in the dirt. But the Apache did not accept death so easily when a debt of honor remained unpaid. A rhythmic chanting began, low at first, vibrating through the wood of the porch, then rising as Elu, the tribe's ancient shaman, ascended the steps. The old man moved with a hunched bird-like grace, his bone necklaces rattling like dry leaves. He knelt beside Silas, pushing aside the useless empty glass vial that had rolled across the floor. Elu did not look at the Western medicine with disdain, but with indifference. It was a tool of the past, and now Silas belonged to the present. From his leather pouch, Elu withdrew a bundle of dried roots and leaves that smelled of earth, fire, and something sharp that stung the nose. He crushed them between stones, mixing the powder with water from a skin bag, chanting words that seemed to command the very spirit of the man to return to his body. The paste was pressed against Silas' chest and forced between his lips. It tasted bitter, like the desert itself, burning its way down his throat. The world went black, but it was not the cold black of the grave. It was a fevered, vivid darkness. For hours, or perhaps days, Silas drifted on a sea of fire and ice. In his delirium, he saw the faces of his wife and child long gone, but they were not calling him to join them. They were smiling, pointing back toward the light. He felt cool hands on his forehead, heard the soft murmur of voices, and smelled the smoke of campfires that were not his own. The terrifying rhythm of the war drums became a heartbeat, steady and strong, replacing the erratic fluttering in his own chest. The boundaries of his small, lonely life were being burned away, replaced by something vast and interconnected. When Silas finally opened his eyes, the blinding sun of the Arizona Territory was high overhead, but the light didn't hurt. He took a breath, deep and full, and the crushing weight was gone, replaced by a dull, manageable ache. He was lying not on the hardwood of the porch, but on a bed of furs and blankets, far softer than anything he had owned in decades. He pushed himself up, his muscles weak but responsive. The sight that greeted him stopped him cold. The Broken Wheel Ranch was no longer a desolate outpost of a dying man. The barren dust bowl around his cabin had been transformed into a bustling encampment. Teepees made of buffalo hide dotted the landscape, their geometric patterns stark against the red rocks. Smoke curled from a dozen fires, carrying the scent of roasting meat and sage. Children ran between the horses, their laughter a sound that this land had not heard in 20 years. Silas stood up, steadying himself on the railing. He wasn't a prisoner. He was the center of the camp. Warriors who walked past the porch stopped and raised their hands in silent salute, eyes filled with a profound respect, reserved for the bravest of their own. They didn't see a frail old white man. They saw the warrior who had stood unarmed against a posse to protect the chief's blood. Silas realized with a jolt that the isolation he had feared, the loneliness that had been his constant companion, was gone forever. He had given his life to save a stranger, and in return, they had given him a life he never could have imagined. Chief Talon approached the porch, leading a magnificent stallion, its coat the color of a storm cloud. Kaya walked beside her father, her wounds bandaged and healing, a vibrant sash of red cloth tied around her waist. She smiled at Silas, a smile that bridged the gap between their worlds, acknowledging the bond of blood and sacrifice that now linked them. Talon stopped at the foot of the stairs and waited until Silas met his gaze. There were no treaties signed, no government papers exchanged, no words of English spoken to formalize what was happening. The chief simply handed the reins of the stallion to Silas. It was a gift of kings, a steed fit for a war chief. By accepting the reins, Silas was accepting his place in the tribe. He walked down the steps, his legs feeling stronger with every motion. As he took the leather straps, the surrounding warriors began to beat their spears against their shields. A rhythmic, thundering applause that echoed off the red rock ridge. It was a sound of acceptance, of power, and of warning to anyone who would dare cross the boundaries of this sanctuary. Silas Thorne, the man who had been waiting to die, mounted the horse. He looked out over the valley toward the horizon where Judson and his men had fled. He knew they would never return. The legend of the rancher who commanded the Apache nation would spread through every saloon and sheriff's office in the territory. The Broken Wheel Ranch was no longer just a piece of property. It was a stronghold. Elu stepped forward one last time, handing Silas a new pouch, identical to his own, filled with the herbs that kept the heart strong. The message was clear. His life was no longer measured in days or weeks, but in seasons and years. The tribe would not let him fall. Silas looked at the amber vial lying in the dust, the sun glinting off the glass. It looked small and insignificant now. He turned his horse toward the open plains, riding alongside Talon and Kaya as they began a patrol of their shared land. The wind whipped through his grey beard, and for the first time in a long time, Silas Thorne didn't worry about his heart stopping. He was too busy living. The sun set over the ridge, casting long shadows across the valley, painting the world in gold and crimson, a fitting backdrop for the man who had traded his death for a legacy that would outlast the stone and dust of the frontier. The story of the rancher and the chief was etched into the land itself, a testament to the power of mercy in a merciless world. Hit like if this chief's incredible gratitude moved you, and subscribe for more powerful stories from the American frontier.